To believe the only monsters a soldier must face are made of flesh and blood is the most dangerous lie ever whispered into the ear of a recruit. I have seen what they bring back, stitched into the very fabric of their uniforms. Not medals, not scars, but shadows that cling to them like a second skin. They are taught to fight an enemy they can see, a target they can acquire through a scope. But no one prepares them for the enemy that moves in the periphery, the one that whispers through the radio static between orders, the one that waits in the cold silence of a freshly dug trench. The battlefield is not just a place of death, it is a place of birth. It is a wound upon the earth, and through that wound, things that have slept for centuries are now beginning to stir, drawn by the scent of fear and spilled blood. They speak of courage, of valor, of the brotherhood of arms, but they do not speak of the cold dread that seeps up from the soil itself, a soil saturated with the final, terrified thoughts of generations. This is not about the horrors of war you see in films. This is about the horror that watches the war, the silent spectators in the blasted trees, the faces that flicker in the cracked mirrors of abandoned homes. The things that crawl out of the earth when the shelling stops and the screaming turns to whimpers. These soldiers, these brave men and women, they become beacons in the dark. Their heightened senses, their adrenaline, their proximity to the veil between worlds, it makes them burn so brightly to the things that feast on such energies. They are the keepers of secrets they can never tell. But tonight, I will whisper them for you. Listen closely. The first story is not one of grandeur or epic battle, but of a quiet, creeping decay of the soul, one that began in the sterile safety of a training barracks. It was a place scrubbed clean, smelling of pine disinfectant and polish, but a stain remained that no chemical could ever remove. A young recruit, no older than a boy, had taken his own life in bunk number 12. An unfortunate yet common tragedy, quickly covered and forgotten by the ceaseless machine of military readiness. But the room itself did not forget. It held the memory like a lung holds a final ragged breath. Every new group of recruits assigned to that room would speak of the cold that clung to one specific corner. A cold so deep it felt like it was radiating from inside their own bones. The whispers began soon after. At first, they sounded like the wind, a draft under the door. Then they sharpened. They became coherent, a soft, pleading voice that would repeat the boy's name over and over in the dead of night, when the only other sound was the nervous breathing of sleeping men. Then came the polished boots. A lone pair would be found, placed neatly at the foot of bunk 12, gleaming as if freshly prepared for an inspection that would never come. No one ever admitted to placing them there. They would be moved, locked away, only to reappear the next morning, silent accusers in the pale light. The room was feeding on their fear, and the memory of that boy was becoming something solid, something patient. This is the first truth of such places. Structures hold memories, not in a poetic sense, but in a literal, terrifying way. Wood and stone and steel are porous to human emotion, especially emotions as potent as despair and violent death. A barracks is not a home. It is a container for fear, anxiety, and aggression. Every shout from a drill sergeant, every tear shed in secret, every drop of blood from a training accident, it soaks into the walls. It creates a psychic residue, a layer of spiritual grime that builds up over decades until the building itself gains a kind of rudimentary consciousness. It becomes a tomb that breathes, and the echoes of its most tormented occupants are doomed to replay their final moments for anyone sensitive enough to listen. It is a broken mirror, reflecting a past that never ended. The true horror of that barracks room was not the ghost of the boy himself, but what the lingering presence did to the living. The soldiers quartered there became irritable, paranoid. Fights would break out over nothing. Sleep offered no rest. only nightmares of falling from a great height, or of an inspection that could never be passed, with a faceless officer screaming inches from their face. The boys' despair had become a contagion. It was an invisible sickness that eroded the ironclad discipline they were trained to embody. They were being broken down not by an enemy they could shoot, but by the crushing weight of a single forgotten suicide. The door to that room creaked open not just to a hallway, but to a very specific kind of hell, one paved with polish and regret. Do you feel this dark message was meant for you? The chill you feel is a resonance, a sign that you understand the world is not as solid as they tell you. Now, let us leave the cold sterility of the barracks and venture into the suffocating, living darkness of the jungle. Imagine a green hell so dense, the sunlight is a distant memory, a place where the air is thick and wet, and every leaf drip sounds like a footstep. A patrol. 5 men were sent on a reconnaissance mission, a simple task on paper. But the jungle they entered was ancient, and it did not welcome them. It was a place that had watched empires rise and fall, and the brief, violent passage of these men was an irritation to something primordial that slept beneath the roots of the trees. The whispers started on the second day. They were different from the barracks ghost. These were cunning, intelligent. They mimicked the rustle of leaves, the call of a strange bird, and then the voices of the men themselves. A soldier named PFC Harris heard his mother calling his name, a sweet, beckoning sound from just beyond the thicket. He almost broke formation before his sergeant grabbed him, hissing that he was hearing things. Later, the sergeant himself heard the distinct sound of his own daughter laughing, a sound that froze the blood in his veins because she was thousands of miles away. The whispers were learning. They were probing their minds, plucking out their most cherished memories and twisting them into bait. The jungle was hunting them, not their bodies, but their sanity. What the stars don't tell you openly is that some places on this earth are aware. They are not merely collections of rock and vegetation. They are entities. Ancient forests, vast deserts, abyssal oceans. They have a spirit, a genius Losha, that slumbers. War is the thing that wakes them. The sound of gunfire, the stench of cordite and blood, the vibration of fear. It is a dinner bell for these ancient intelligences. The crows that circle overhead are not just birds. They are the EYs of the forest. The sudden silence is not an absence of sound. It is the forest holding its breath, waiting. These soldiers had trespassed upon holy or perhaps unholy ground. They had disturbed a presence that viewed their conflict as a brief, noisy interruption of its eternal dream, and it had decided to play with them before it consumed them. The patrol never completed its mission. They stumbled back to base 3 days later, 2 men short, the survivors gaunt and hollow-eyed, refusing to speak of what happened. They only repeated one phrase over and over. It wore our friends' voices. The 2 missing men were never found. No bodies, no equipment, no signs of a struggle. It was as if the jungle had simply swallowed them whole, digesting them into the soil to feed its ancient roots. The official report cited disorientation and enemy action, another clean, simple lie to file away. But the survivors knew the truth. The enemy they faced wasn't on any map. It was the map itself, and it was still out there, whispering, learning, and waiting for the next trespassers. Every soul that joins feeds the voice that whispers from the darkness. Your presence here gives strength to these warnings. From the suffocating green, we now travel to the suffocating white heat of the desert, a different kind of emptiness, but no less alive. In the shimmering haze of a forward operating base in a land of sand and forgotten gods, a new fear was given a name, the Sand-Stalker. It wasn't a legend told around a fire. It was a conclusion drawn from a series of inexplicable disappearances. Lone sentries, posted on the perimeter during the dead of night, would simply vanish. All that was left behind was their rifle, standing upright, its barrel stuck into the sand, and a single, shallow trench trailing off into the dunes, as if something had been dragged away from beneath. The creature, if it could be called that, was never seen clearly. Those who caught a glimpse of it spoke of a ripple in the sand, a distortion in the moonlight, like heat haze but moving with a terrifying purpose. It moved impossibly fast, and it was silent. It didn't hunt with claws or teeth in a way they understood. It seemed to unmake things. One terrified corporal swore he saw it rise from the sand to take his friend. He described it not as a solid form, but as a column of swirling sand that briefly took on a humanoid shape, with points of cold, black space where its eyes should have been. Then it collapsed, and his friend was simply gone, the sound of his scream swallowed by the immense, uncaring silence of the desert night. The desert is a crucible. It is a place of extremes that strips away all that is unnecessary. Water, life, sanity. It is a vast, cracked mirror, reflecting the blinding, indifferent sun. This environment does not just test the body, it applies a terrible psychic pressure to the mind. In that silence, a soldier's fears have room to grow, to fester, to become monstrous. The Sand-Stalker may have been a creature of myth, an ancient djinn disturbed by the war, or it may have been something else. It may have been a projection, a tulpa, born from the collective terror and isolation of 100 young men staring out into an ocean of sand, expecting death to come from any direction. They feared the land itself, and so the land itself grew teeth. The disappearances became so frequent that the commanders had to change protocol. No more lone sentries. Men were posted in pairs, back to back, constantly moving. The base became a fortress of light in the oppressive darkness, generators humming all night to keep the shadows at bay. The Sand-Stalker was never caught, never killed. It simply stopped hunting when its prey became more difficult. But the men knew it was still out there, just beneath the surface, a patient, granular predator waiting for the lights to flicker. They were no longer fighting a human enemy. They were fighting the landscape, and it was a war they could never ever win. The dried blood of their comrades was now part of the endless dunes. From the primal fears of the natural world, we turn to a more modern horror, one that travels on wires and whispers through technology. In a signals intelligence outpost, a young specialist named Corporal Miller sat for 12 hours a day, listening to the cacophony of the airwaves. His job was to sift through the static, to find the faint, coded whispers of the enemy. But lately, he had been hearing something else. Amidst the hiss and crackle, a voice would emerge, faint but clear. It was the voice of his friend, Sergeant Ben Carter, who had been killed in an ambush 2 months prior. The first time, it was just his name. Miller, you there, buddy? Miller dismissed it as grief, an auditory hallucination brought on by exhaustion and sorrow. But the voice returned, night after night, always on the same frequency, a channel that was supposed to be dead air. It grew stronger, clearer. It was undeniably Ben's voice. He spoke of old memories, inside jokes, things only the two of them could possibly know. It was comforting at first, a ghostly reprieve from the crushing loneliness of his post. Miller began to look forward to it, to his secret conversations with the dead. He started keeping a log, transcribing their talks. Ben seemed fine. He said it wasn't so bad on the other side. He was just in a different kind of waiting room, and he was glad he could still reach out. Miller felt a sense of peace he hadn't known since Ben's death. He was breaking protocol, but it felt like a sacred duty. And this is where everything changes for you. Because you must understand that the tools we build are not inert. A radio receiver is a sensitive instrument, designed to pick up faint, organized energy patterns out of chaos. What is a ghost? A lingering consciousness, if not a faint, organized energy pattern. The static between stations is not empty. It is a veil. Our technology in its relentless quest to communicate has inadvertently created electronic seances. We have built our own creaking doors to the other side. Miller wasn't just talking to his friend's memory. He was talking to an EO-Cho trapped in the machine, a fragment of a soul caught in the electromagnetic web that now blankets our entire world. It was a digital ghost story, a modern summoning. The messages from Ben began to change. The comforting tone vanished, replaced by a cold urgency. He started giving Miller warnings, telling him about enemy movements with uncanny accuracy, saving his unit from 2 separate attacks. Miller became a hero, his intel deemed miraculous. But then Ben started asking for things in return. Small at first. Miller, go to my locker. Throw away the picture of Sarah. She needs to move on. Then the requests grew darker. Miller, Sergeant Davis. He was the one who called in the wrong coordinates. It was his fault. You need to make him pay. The voice was no longer his friend. It was an intelligence wearing his friend's voice like a mask, and it was filled with cold rage and a thirst for vengeance. Miller was no longer a radio operator. He was the vessel for a whispering damnation. Now imagine this. You are alone, on watch, in a forgotten corner of a war-torn country. The only thing you have for company is your own reflection, staring back at you from a polished piece of metal, a shard of a broken mirror, or the darkened screen of a piece of equipment. You see your own tired, fearful eyes. But one night, you look, and for a fraction of a second, the face looking back is not yours. The eyes are different, the set of the jaw is harder, and the expression is one of pure, unadulterated contempt. You blink, and it's gone. It's just you again. But the seed of doubt, the cold splinter of dread, has been planted. This was the reality for a young Marine stationed at a remote outpost, a man whose psyche was already beginning to fray from months of isolation and constant threat. The apparitions in his reflection became more frequent, more distinct. The other face would linger for seconds at a time. It was his face, but twisted, older, crueler, with a network of scars he did not possess. It would mouth words at him, silent insults, threats. He tried to ignore it, to rationalize it as a trick of the light, a symptom of combat stress. He cleaned every reflective surface, tried to avoid his own gaze, but it was impossible. He would catch it in the chrome of his weapon, the lens of his night vision goggles, even in a puddle of murky water. The other face was always there, watching him, a silent passenger inside his own skin. He felt like he was losing his mind, a slow, terrifying erosion of his own identity. The concept of the doppelgänger, the spirit double, is an ancient omen of doom. It is not an external ghost, but an internal schism, a psychic splintering. Under the immense pressure of war, the human soul can crack. The doppelgänger is the shadow self, the personification of all the fear, the rage, and the terrible things a soldier must do to survive. It is the part of them that has to die inside so the body can live. For this Marine, his reflection was a manifestation of his own trauma. It was the face of the killer he was forced to become, and that killer was now looking back at him, demanding to be acknowledged, demanding control. It was a civil war being fought within the confines of his own skull. The breaking point came during a firefight. He was taking cover, and in the polished metal of his ammunition box, he saw the other face again. But this time, it was smiling, a wide, predatory grin as the bullets flew past. In that moment, he understood. The reflection wasn't just a passive image. It was enjoying the chaos. It thrived on the violence. He smashed the box with the butt of his rifle, shattering the image. But it was too late. He could feel it inside him, a cold presence behind his own eyes. He survived the battle, but the man who walked out of it was no longer the same. He no longer flinched at his reflection. Sometimes, when he thought no one was looking, he would stare into a mirror and give a slow, cold smile, a perfect imitation of the monster he had seen. The doppelganger hadn't just been an omen, it had been a replacement. We speak of men who go missing in action, swallowed by the chaos of battle. But what of a man who vanishes from a locked room, in the heart of a secure base, leaving behind nothing but a mystery that smells of cold ashes? This is the story of Specialist Davies, a quiet logistics clerk who was there one moment and gone the next. He shared a small windowless room with one other soldier. One evening, his roommate left for a 2-hour shift. He locked the door from the outside, the only way to secure it. When he returned, the door was still locked, but when he opened it, Davies' bunk was empty, perfectly made. All of his belongings were in place. Davies himself was gone. A frantic search of the base revealed nothing. He hadn't passed the gate guards. The perimeter fence was intact. The security footage from the hallway showed the roommate leaving, and then returning 2 hours later. No one else entered or left the corridor. Specialist Davies had vanished from inside a sealed box. The only thing out of the ordinary was a faint, lingering smell in the room, which the roommate described as the scent of a fireplace the morning after the fire has died. A smell of cold ashes, and on the concrete floor next to Davies' bunk was a faint circular scorch mark, as if something intensely hot but brief had been there. It was a puzzle with no solution, a violation of all known logic. Listen carefully, because this is crucial. Our world is not as solid as it seems. We exist in a specific vibration, a certain frequency of reality, but there are other places, other dimensions, layered over our own like sheets of rotting parchment, liminal spaces, doorways, crossroads, and in this case, military bases, are places where the veil between these worlds is thin. A military base is a temporary, artificial construct of order imposed on a foreign landscape. It is a place outside of normal society, governed by its own strange rules. These conditions can create weak spots, energetic fissures in the fabric of reality. A door in such a place might not always lead to the hallway you expect. For Specialist Davies, for one terrifying, inexplicable moment, his door may have opened somewhere else. The official explanation was desertion. They claimed Davies must have had an accomplice, that he somehow slipped away despite the utter lack of evidence. It was a neat and tidy lie to preserve the illusion of control. But his roommate knew better. He was haunted by that empty bunk, by the impossible disappearance of his friend. He would wake up in the night, swearing he could hear Davies' voice, not as a whisper, but as a distant, distorted scream, a sound that seemed to come from very far away and from all directions at once. He was hearing an echo from across the dimensional divide, the last testament of a man who had stepped through a creaking door that should never have been opened, and was now lost in the ashes of a world unknown. The sins of the past do not stay buried. They seep into the soil, poisoning the land for generations. An airbase, built on the foundations of a village, destroyed in a previous forgotten war, learned this lesson in the most chilling way possible. The pilots and mechanics began to see her. A young girl, no more than 7 or 8 years old, with dark, solemn eyes and wearing clothes that were decades out of date. She would be seen at the edge of the runway at dusk, a tiny, silent figure standing perfectly still. As the billion-dollar fighter jets thundered past, she never flinched. She only watched, her gaze filled with a profound, unnerving sadness. No one knew who she was or where she came from. She would vanish if anyone tried to approach her. The presence of the child began to have a tangible effect on the base. Instruments would malfunction without cause. Engines would fail during pre-flight checks, only to work perfectly moments later. A strange, oppressive melancholy settled over the entire airfield, a collective grief for a tragedy they had no part in. The pilots, men of logic and steel, began to talk in hushed tones. They felt her eyes on them as they took off, a silent judgment from the ground. They started having shared nightmares of a burning village, of the screams of women and children, of the shadow of a great winged bird passing overhead. They were experiencing the final moments of the ghost girl's life, a psychic scar left on the very land they now occupied. Every war leaves behind ghosts. Most are the spirits of soldiers, still bound by duty or rage. But the most powerful, the most lasting, are the ghosts of the innocent. The psychic trauma of a child's violent death is a cataclysm. It is a scream that never truly fades. It just lowers in frequency until it becomes a part of the landscape's background radiation. This girl was not a vengeful spirit in the traditional sense. She wasn't there to harm them. She was a constant, heartbreaking reminder. Her presence was a broken cross planted in the heart of their military machine, a testament to the fact that their runway was paved over a graveyard, their barracks built on the ashes of a home. She was the conscience of the land itself. The sightings became so disruptive, morale so low, that the base chaplain, a wise and pragmatic man, organized an unofficial memorial service. They didn't know her name, so they simply called her the Little Watcher. They erected a small unmarked stone at the edge of the airfield, and the men would leave small offerings, a piece of chocolate, a shiny coin, a wildflower. After that, the sightings became less frequent. The oppressive sadness lifted. The child had not been looking for revenge. She had been looking for acknowledgement, for a simple admission that something terrible had happened on that spot. They had appeased the ghost by honoring her memory, but they all knew she was still there, a silent, eternal sentry, guarding a tomb of dried blood and forgotten sorrow. Do you feel this dark message was meant for you? Your unease is a form of sight. Let it guide you deeper into the gloom. Now we march into the twilight, with a platoon on a long, arduous trek through hostile hills. As the sun bled out across the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows, the men began to notice something deeply wrong. They would do a head count, and the number would be correct. But as they marched, a feeling of being crowded, of an extra presence, became undeniable. It was then that they saw it. Marching alongside them, perfectly in step, was a shadow that had no source. It was tall and thin, vaguely humanoid, and it wore the distinct shape of a combat helmet. But no man was casting it. It was a solid piece of darkness moving with them. The men tried to ignore it, a collective, unspoken agreement to not acknowledge the impossible thing that kept pace with them. But the fear was a palpable thing, a metallic taste in their mouths. The shadows seemed to grow darker, more defined, as their terror mounted. It didn't seem to have a will of its own. It simply mimicked their movements, a silent, empty parody of a soldier. When they stopped for a break, it would stop too, a motionless patch of absolute blackness on the dusty ground. One brave or foolish soldier tried to step into the shadow. He cried out, pulling his foot back, as if he had been burned. He said the cold was unbearable, a void that felt like it was trying to pull the life right out of him. What the stars don't tell you openly is that fear is an energy. It is a broadcast. In a place of high stress and imminent death, the collective fear of a group of people can coalesce. It can attract things that feed on that specific emotional frequency, or even more terrifyingly, it can create something. The shadow that wore a helmet was not a ghost of a dead soldier. It was a Tulpa, a psychic projection given form by the combined dread of the entire platoon. They were so certain that death was marching with them, that an unseen enemy was in their midst, that they had unknowingly sculpted their own monster out of the very fabric of the twilight. They had given their fear a shape, and now it was following them home. The shadow stayed with them for the entire 3-day march. It was their silent, unwelcome companion. The moment they saw the lights of their base, the moment their fear subsided and was replaced by relief, the shadow simply faded. It dissolved back into the other lengthening shadows of the evening, as if it had never been. The men never spoke of it again, not to their superiors, not even to each other. How could they explain that they had been stalked by their own collective nightmare? But none of them ever looked at their own shadow in the same way again. They had learned a terrible truth. Sometimes the most terrifying enemy you will ever face is the one you bring with you, the one born from the darkness inside your own heart. Every soul that joins feeds the voice that whispers from the darkness. By subscribing, you become part of the choir that carries these tales. Now, we follow the war home. A soldier, Sergeant Reyes, returns from his tour with a small, innocuous souvenir. It was a small, hand-carved wooden bird he had found in the rubble of a bombed-out house. It seemed old, ancient even, and he felt a strange compulsion to take it. He brought it home and placed it on his mantelpiece, a small token of a world he had survived and left behind. But he soon discovered that you can leave the war, but sometimes the war refuses to leave you. The artifact was not just a piece of wood, it was a vessel, it was a key. The atmosphere in his home began to change. A chill seemed to emanate from the mantelpiece where the bird sat. His wife complained of nightmares, of whispers in the empty rooms. The laughter of their children began to sound hollow, strained. Reyes himself became withdrawn, irritable, prone to fits of rage over nothing. He felt as if the dust and dread of the war had followed him home, clinging to him like a shroud. He would find himself staring at the wooden bird for hours, a strange sense of familiarity washing over him, as if the bird were watching him back, its tiny carved eyes filled with a silent, ancient malevolence. The peace he had fought for was being systematically dismantled from the inside out. Objects, especially those from places of great suffering, can absorb the psychic residue of their environment. Think of it like a spiritual battery. The wooden bird had sat in that home for generations, witnessing life, love, and then, suddenly, a horrific, violent end. It was saturated with the terror and pain of the family that had been killed there. It was a vessel of grief, a container for a curse. When Sergeant Reyes picked it up, he didn't just pick up a souvenir. He picked up the lingering spectral rage of a family whose lives had been unjustly extinguished. He had unknowingly invited a ghost, or rather, a whole family of them, into the sanctity of his own home. The dried blood was invisible, but its stain was spreading. The breaking point came when his young daughter woke up screaming, claiming a strange man was standing in the corner of her room, whispering to her in a language she didn't understand. Reyes stormed into the room and saw nothing, but the air was freezing cold. In that moment, he knew the bird was the source. With a cry of rage, he grabbed the artifact from the mantelpiece. It felt unnaturally cold in his hand, and he swore he could hear a chorus of faint, angry whispers coming directly from it. He threw it into his fireplace and watched as the ancient wood was consumed by flames. As it burned, a high-pitched shriek echoed through the house, a sound of pure agony, and then silence. The chill in the house was gone, but the peace was shattered forever. He had brought the war home, and it had almost cost him everything. And this is where everything changes for you, because you begin to see the pattern. The battlefield is not just a physical location. It is a state of being where the rules are different. Our final story is not about a single ghost or a lone creature. It is about an entire unit that stumbled into a place where they did not belong, and awoke something that should have been left to slumber in the earth. A company of engineers was tasked with digging a new line of defensive trenches in a remote, strategically unimportant valley. The ground was strangely hard, filled with unusual dark-colored stones. As they dug deeper, they began to unearth things that were not rocks, fragments of pottery unlike any local design, tools made of an unknown metal, and bones, so many bones. They were not human, but they were not entirely animal either. As night fell on the first day of digging, the strangeness began. A thick, unnatural fog rolled into the valley, blanketing the new trenches, even though the sky above was clear and filled with stars. The fog muffled all sound, creating a sense of profound isolation. Then came the sounds from within the fog, a soft, wet scraping, the snapping of twigs, and a low, guttural chattering that sounded like 1,000 insects, but with a horrifying, almost linguistic pattern to it. The soldiers in the trenches gripped their weapons, their eyes straining to pierce the oppressive white gloom. They were trained to fight men, but what was moving out there in the dark was something else. It was ancient, and it was hungry, and they had just rung the dinner bell by disturbing its tune. What the stars don't tell you openly is that we are not the first. We are merely the current layer of life on a planet that has hosted countless forgotten civilizations. We build our cities and fight our wars on the graveyards of species and cultures so old their names have been erased by time itself. These soldiers, in their ignorance, had dug their trenches directly into a necropolis, a burial ground for something that predated humanity. The things they had awakened were not ghosts in the human sense. They were the original inhabitants, the slumbering guardians of this valley, and they viewed the soldiers as nothing more than soft-fleshed intruders, defilers of their sacred ground. The broken crosses of their own faith offered no protection here. The attack, when it came, was not a coordinated assault. It was a slaughter. Things swarmed out of the fog, gaunt, multi-limbed creatures with pale, sightless eyes and long, sharp claws. They moved with a twitching, insectoid speed. The soldiers' bullets seemed to have little effect, passing through them as if they were not entirely solid. It was a last stand against a tide of primeval horror. The radio operator screamed for backup, his last transmission a garbled cry about things from out of the ground before the line went dead. When reinforcements arrived the next morning, the fog had lifted. They found the trenches filled with bodies, torn apart with a savage, inhuman ferocity. Of the creatures, there was no sign. The army quietly buried the dead, abandoned the position, and struck the entire valley from their operational maps. Some places are not meant to be held. Some doors are not meant to be opened. So you see now, don't you? The uniform is not a shield. It is a mark. It is a declaration to the unseen world that you are a person who walks willingly into places of death and chaos. It makes you a lightning rod for the strange and the terrible. The horrors these soldiers faced were not random occurrences. They were a direct consequence of their profession. They stand on the precipice, on the very edge of the veil, and sometimes things from the other side reach across to pull them in. They are taught to be hyper-vigilant, to trust their senses, but in these encounters, their senses are the very things that betray them, becoming conduits for a fear that can break the strongest of minds. These are not just stories to chill your blood or entertain you for an evening. They are warnings. They are echoes from the darkness, whispers from beyond the firelight. They serve as a testament that the world is far older, far stranger, and infinitely more dangerous than our modern, sanitized sensibilities would have us believe. The men and women who fight our wars are not just fighting other people. They are on the front lines of a conflict with reality itself. They are the unwilling witnesses to the cracks in the mirror of the world, and what they see looking back at them is enough to shatter any soul. They carry these visions with them forever, a collection of cold ashes in their hearts. Remember the soldier who saw a face that was not his own in the mirror. Remember the operator who took orders from the dead. Remember the platoon that was hunted by its own, solidified fear. These are the true wounds of war, the ones that never scar over, the ones that ache with a phantom cold on quiet nights. The greatest threat is not the bullet with your name on it, but the whisper that knows your deepest regret, the shadow that knows your most secret fear. That is the enemy that cannot be defeated, the one that follows you home and takes a seat at your table, waiting patiently for you to let your guard down. Therefore, when you see a soldier, silent and with a 1,000-yard stare, do not assume they are merely remembering the horrors of combat you can imagine. They might be remembering something far, far worse. They might be remembering the moment they realized that the laws of physics were negotiable, that death was not the end, and that humanity is not alone on this earth. They are the guardians of a terrible knowledge, a truth so profound and disturbing that it must remain unspoken. They have stared into the abyss, and the abyss has not only stared back, but it has also followed them home, and it is whispering their name, even now. Do you feel this dark message was meant for you? Let the shadows of your own room confirm it. Every soul that joins feeds the voice that whispers from the darkness. Stay with us. There are so many more secrets to tell.